right, so as of the day that we're recording this this edition of What to Read, there is a lot going on. I've spent the entire morning while Jason was trying to move like equipment into place and everything, and I was sitting here just completely transfixed by this hearing.
I was working, she was watching television.
That is true, but I was watching TV for work. Like, you know, watching TV is part of my job. And today I was actually watching this Bill Barr hearing. William Barr finally dragged his...
Shut your mouth.
Behind into the hearing. Now, keep in mind that Barr has been resisting the subpoenas that were calling for him, demanding that he come before the House Judiciary Committee for months. He's been essentially brushing off these hearing demands because the Trump administration doesn't believe that they have to listen to subpoenas. But now he, quote unquote, voluntarily showed up today to be grilled by Democrats and to be praised as just the greatest man ever by Republicans. And the thing that was so incredible about this, besides Jim Jordan literally screaming.
What is wrong with that man?
I wonder if he... Can you imagine him like going through the drive-thru at McDonald's?
No.
I said I want a Big Mac.
Well,
I want a Big Mac and a large Coke.
But it seems like that's part of his style, but it's actually grating on the nerves.
He's in hysterics at all. Bill Barr, you're the greatest. It's like, okay, you could say that in a normal tone of voice, man. I think we all can hear you. You have a microphone. You don't have to scream. So you know, Jordan did that. Jerry Nadler running the hearing. You know, he actually held it together because he did stop Bill Barr from talking more than he really ought to. He did hold him. He kept him in case of it. But the thing that was so extraordinary about listening
couldn't keep his other members in check, though.
But they all were trying to spout off because they all wanted to be like, no. I need to say how much I love Bill Barr. No. It's my turn to say how much I love Bill Barr. Also love you, Donald Trump. Don't worry, we love you so much. You're the greatest president ever. Please don't tweet mean things at me. That's literally what Republican and Democratic hearings are like. Democrats do their questions and they try to question the witness. Republicans like are almost tripping over each other. It's like, no, Bill Barr, you're the greatest person that ever lived. Also, Donald Trump is, please tell Donald Trump how much I love him. Will you please, if you see him later today, just let him know how much I love him. And, you know, we're with him all the way. And he can be king if he wants. It doesn't matter. He doesn't ever have to leave.
I would have to go home and take several showers, man.
I don't know how they get through it. But, I mean, the thing that was... Okay, I'll point out a few things about this hearing that, you know, finally hearing Barr speak up for himself. Number one, Barr said when he was asked, I believe it was by Congressman Cedric Richmond, will Donald Trump accept the results of the November election if he loses? And his answer, I don't know if I apologize if it wasn't Cedric Richmond, his answer was if he and the president believe that the election was legitimate, then they'll accept it. Then they will leave.
So what standards are they going to make to determine if...
That's the problem. There's a if there. There shouldn't be an if. When the election is decided and it's called and that's it, you're supposed to leave. But even the Attorney General of the United States, this was the first time we heard the Attorney General say it. We've heard Trump say he may not accept it. He said, we'll have to see. When Donald Trump has been asked if he would accept the results of the election if he loses, he said, we'll have to see. For the first time, the Attorney General of the United States also said, if they believed the results were legitimate. And then they were probed a little bit more. He was probed a little bit more in some other questions. Well, what is it that you think will be illegitimate? Mail-in voting. He actually said, Bill Barr, after admitting that he himself votes by mail-in voting.
He said one time.
He said, I think maybe, he trust and believe.
He's full of
William
crap.
Barr is not standing in line at some local elementary school voting. He votes by mail. They all do. But it's okay for him to do it. But if everyone gets to do it, then, you know, especially, you know, all the blacks are doing it and the browns are doing it. Everybody's doing it. Well, that can't be real. He then had the nerve to say that he thinks it could open up the election to foreign interference. This is the same William Barr who said that the actual FBI investigation of real foreign interference by Russia in the 2016 election was a fraudulent investigation, never should have happened. That wasn't a real investigation, even though our 16 intelligence services or so said that Russia was interfering in the election. Robert Mueller, after a $40 million investigation, said Russia interfered in the election. All of it to help Donald Trump. He said that entire thing was poorly based. It shouldn't have happened. That should not have been investigated. Never should have happened. But he thinks mail-in voting opens the door to fraudulent voting from overseas. I see. The other things that were said, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, unnerved William Barr. She was one of many people who really threw him off his game and really unnerved him when she said, how is it that you seem so concerned about sending violent troopers into Lafayette Park to pepper spray and tear gas peaceful protesters, including the rector of St. John's Church, who was also pepper sprayed and tear gas in Lafayette Park, so that they could clear the way for Donald Trump to do his upside down Bible photo op at St. John's, because he needed it all to be cleared so he could get a nice photo op. That was justifiable to Barr, but that he didn't seem to have a problem with armed right-wing, mainly white male protesters storming into government buildings in places like Michigan and threatening to lynch the governor of Michigan and behead her for putting on a mask order. He didn't have a problem with that. He never answered the question.
No, because those guys are patriots.
Right.
They're patriots.
And if you think, he called the protests around the country for Black Lives Matter mobs, unruly mobs who were trying to burn down. Several Republicans got, with leading questions said, if your patriotic forces hadn't gone in there in their fake military uniforms, would those buildings have been burned to the ground? And he said, oh yeah, definitely. No. These are moms, veterans, dads. They're in Portland, in Portlandia. We're going to burn down the federal courthouse, but he's okay with armed AR-15 wielding right-wing white male protesters screaming into the faces of the armed guards there and threatening to behead and lynch the governor. That he doesn't have a problem with. He never answered that question. He didn't have an answer for that.
He doesn't have an answer for it because he condones it.
So the problem that we have now in America is that I think we are really, Malcolm Nance talks about this a lot. Sarah Kendzior talks about this a lot. Naveed Jamali talks about it a lot. Masha Gessen has talked about it. We've had a lot of guests on What to Read and also on the Readout and on AM Joy. All of these programs that I'm involved in, they're all unified in their concern that our democracy is teetering. And our democracy is teetering not just because of Donald Trump. If it was just Donald Trump, it wouldn't be a problem. Donald Trump really couldn't do much while he's... did you see the story where he pretended like he was invited to go throughout the first pitch at the Yankee game and they never invited him?
Of course.
I mean, so he's doing silly stuff like that and he can't walk down a ramp. Like, by himself, Donald Trump is really not that threatening. He's just really mean and nasty, but he couldn't really do anything. The problem he has is that he has other people who are willing to do the dirty work.
No, but that's the problem.
And that's what makes him so dangerous. It's
his meanness makes him
right. His meanness is a problem, but it's the people who are willing to implement the cruelty and the anti-democratic activity, things like William Barr. That's what I really worry about. I don't really so much worry about Donald Trump's tweets, even though it does terrify Republicans. I'm not worried about that. Donald Trump could just tweet crazy things and that wouldn't be a problem. It would just be unnerving.
Just be the crazy man in that house on the hill.
Right. It's the people who implement it. It's the governors who say, well, if Donald Trump says I'm not supposed to have a mask order, I won't. If Donald Trump doesn't give me permission, I won't close my state down. I'll leave it open because Donald Trump says. It's the bars that say, if we think the election was legit in our opinion, then we'll leave. Well, that's a big if then in a democracy, because that's not the way democracy works. If Donald Trump loses the election, he's supposed to leave. And Barr, the Attorney General of the United States, is not supposed to if-then that. That is just actually what's supposed to happen. So we're talking a lot about democracy on this episode. And to that end, I think we have a really great guest in mind.
I'm ready. I'm excited. It's going to be a fun one.
This is somebody that I want to talk to for a long time. I'll talk to her a little bit about how I got to know her first. But she's somebody that I first saw on MSNBC. And then got the opportunity to meet. I saw her on the Melissa Harris Perry show and was like, wow. And I got a chance to meet her and talk to her. And this is one of the most brilliant people in the world. So let's just bring her in. All right, joining me now is the great Stacey Abrams, who has become quite a political star since her run for governor in the state of Georgia, in her goal to become the first black woman governor, which shockingly in 2021 we still have not a black woman governor. Stacey Abrams' book is Our Time Is Now. This is her new book, the New York Times bestselling author, Stacey Abrams. The subtitle of it is Power, Purpose, and the Fight for a Fair America. Stacey, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, you open this book with a quote from one of the greats, Fannie Lou Hamer, and the quote says, "We will stay and stand up for what belongs to us as American citizens because they can't say that we haven't had patience." I think that's it's a fitting quote to start with, because it does feel like The argument that's always made against the progress that Black people have tried to make is that it's too feisty. Can't you just be patient? It was the argument made against Dr. King. It was the reason he wrote the letter from a Birmingham jail. It's people saying, you guys just, if you could just calm down and just work in the system. But, your election that you went through in 2018, I think proved to a lot of people that the system is thoroughly broken. Talk to us about what you believe that you can do about that and why you wrote this book.
Well, in the wake of 2018, I, took 10 days to decide next steps. We were in the midst of fighting the Secretary of State over purged voters, missing ballots, excessive use of of provisional ballots. We had absentee ballots that were thrown out without cause. And we had some of the longest lines in America, including the longest lines for African Americans in 2018. And my first responsibility was to fight to make certain every one of those votes got counted. But as we got closer and closer to the end of the election, I was very aware of the fact that I was running against the Secretary of State, and that likely given the range of bad actions, it was likely he was going to be the victor, at least on paper. My responsibility was to decide, was I going to fight to make myself the governor, or was I going to fight to make Georgians actual citizens and participants in their democracy? And in my mind, there was no question. I was raised by civil rights activists who joined the cause when they were teenagers, and any job I could have held would pale in comparison to the responsibility I had to ensure that the right to vote was made real and manifest for my fellow Georgians. But the more I thought about it, I realized that Georgia was emblematic of the problem, but we are not the singularity. And so I really expanded the scope of what we were going to work on to include a national conversation about voter suppression, something that was not happening. The book enters the question because I was asked to write a retrospective. Some wanted me to write a polemical narrative about voting. And I really wanted to focus on the future. Here's what we've learned. Here's what we know. And here's what's possible. And so this book really is my answer to what's next. The title is very intentional. We have reached this demographic promised land that, political scientists have been prophesying for decades, but we haven't yet learned to not only navigate it, but to leverage it in a sustained way. And so to your point about patience, I'm originally I was born in Wisconsin, but grew up in Mississippi, and Fannie Lou Hamer is a hero. And her notion of patience is exactly right. We have done that. We have been patient. We have been left out of the narrative of America's future for too long. And now their time is up, because our time is now.
Yeah, and I want to read a little bit of just from the introduction. It's quite prophetic, given just what's happening on the week that we're recording this. John Lewis is lying in state in the rotunda, in the Capitol Rotunda. Something only 3 African Americans have ever been gifted with in terms of African American lawmakers and great African Americans. So he's laying in state as of today. And you write this in your introduction. Civil rights icon Congressman John Lewis often refers to the right to vote as almost sacred. As a child of ministers, I understand his hesitation to label a simple secular act as sacred. Voting is an act of faith. It is profound. In a democracy, it is the ultimate power. Through the vote, the poor can access financial means. The infirm can find health care supports, and the burdened and heavy laden can receive a measure of relief from social safety net that serves us, from a social safety net that serves all. And we're willing to go to war to defend the sacred. And you add, I'm not calling for violent revolt here. And you talk about the fact that in our nation's history, we've had to fight and with a capital F for this simple freedom. What do you make of the fact that, on the day that we're recording this, William Barr, who was the Attorney General of the United States, testified that in his view, allowing everyone to vote the way he has voted by mail would cause the election to be stolen. And his additional comment that if he and Donald Trump decide that in their belief the election was fair, then they will leave.
I think he forgets that despite the best efforts of his leadership of the Justice Department and the president's leadership of the White House, we remain a democracy and not an authoritarian regime, that the decision of how a ballot is cast should be determined by the voter, and that in a democracy, every effort should be made to expand access to the right to vote to every eligible citizen, not to the citizens we like, not to the citizens who agree with us, not to the citizens who meet our narrow definition of acceptable, because those have been choices that have been made throughout the American history. We have reached a place where we should be able to say that if you are eligible, we will grant you the most basic fundamental premise of democracy, which is the right to be heard. And what we have seen from Bill Barr, what we have seen from Donald Trump, what we have seen from his cronies and sycophants and lackeys is this notion that democracy is not their intention. Their intention is autocracy. Their intention is an oligarchy where they rule and where the rest of us are simply supplicants hoping to be included. That's not America. It may be the America we end up with if we don't have the right to vote. But until that time, he does not have the right to determine when they come and when they go. That is the premise of, and that is the promise of a democracy. The people choose and the people will decide.
One of the, you write about the false seduction of voter ID in this book. You write about a lot of sort of the technical things that are thrown in front of people who are trying to exercise the franchise. But voter ID is one in particular that, you get this answer back from conservatives that, well, if you all want to protect the right to vote, why don't you just agree that everyone should have to use voter ID? What do you say back to that argument?
Number one, every state requires some form of identification, and identification has been a part of voting from the beginning of this nation. No one argues with the idea that you should have to say who you are. The difference between now and 20 years ago was that the barriers to that proof were not so high and not so intricately designed to push people out of the process. I use as an example in the book, a woman who was at 100 was told that she did not exist for the purposes of voting, despite the fact that she had participated in elections for most of her adult life post this Voting Rights Act. But here's the fundamental piece that we lose in this argument. Voter fraud is not an issue. If you use the most aggressive math from the Heritage Foundation, and they have done their best, they have scoured the world and the nation to find stories, regardless of their veracity and their utility, I'll give them all 1,300 stories they've collected out of 625 million votes cast. It is not a problem. But what is true is that millions are purged from the rolls. What is true is that hundreds of thousands are prevented from voting because the rules change about how they prove who they are. And sometimes those rule changes are designed for things that are impossible to meet. So, for example, that 100-year-old woman could not prove her identity because she had to provide an original birth certificate that the law denied her because she was born during segregation in the South and was not given a birth certificate. And even though she could prove that she was in the 1930 census, it was insufficient to grant her proof of identity to cast a ballot. So she could have boarded a plane, she could have purchased alcohol, but she could not cast a vote as a citizen. That is wrong.
It's scary too, because the aggressiveness with which people, not just Brian Kemp, but everyone who thinks like him, people like Bill Barr, people like Donald Trump, the aggressiveness with which they fight against allowing people to vote. And just, even though groups like yours, Fair Fight Action, are being just as aggressive in pushing back, what's your biggest fear in terms of what happens this November? And do you think that if the right to vote is not defended in 2020 with this kind of an attorney general and this kind of president in office, and they manage to keep control of power, what's your big fear for what will happen to our democracy?
Our democracy is doomed. I mean, and that sounds histrionic, but if you look around the world, some of the world's most stable democracies have fallen in recent years. Erdogan took over Turkey, one of the most vibrant and secular democracies in the world, and it is now an authoritarian autocracy. If you look at India, Modi has done his best to suppress the minority rights of the Muslims, but to also empower himself and enlarge himself as a populist authoritarian. If you look at Hungary, one of the shining stars of the post-Cold War nation states that stood up and demanded democracy, it has now fallen to Viktor Orban. And in our own hemisphere, what's happening in Brazil under Bolsonaro is very much indicative of what is happening in the United States, which is that we have authoritarian populists who are undermining the very functions of democracy. They do so beginning with the sort of charm offensive of being contrary to the norm. But when they get inside, they dismantle access to the very protections that democracy should provide, namely eliminating inspectors general, stacking the deck with the courts, and making sure that those who should be answerable to the people become answerable to the head of state. That is what is at stake. And that is what we have seen play out in real time, where the checks and balances have been unmoored from our democracy. And without the right to vote being made real and people being able to cast their ballots in this election, I do not believe our democracy can withstand another 4 years of Trump and his cronies.
Yeah, I mean, you write in this book about, we get pieces of your life and how you emerged as somebody who has centralized these issues in your own life. You write about yourself as a 19-year-old in 1993, going to the Lincoln Memorial, where with this commemoration, the 30th anniversary of the March on Washington, and the idea that you were leading voter registration efforts already on campus. You were already an activist. I look out at these crowds and I see a lot of young people out there marching. George Floyd put a lot of young people out into the streets, and you see a lot of activism around Black Lives Matter, not just Black young people, but young people in general. My question is, how do you, in your view, translate the kind of passion that we're seeing on the streets of cities all over the country, in Louisville, in Portland, in Minneapolis, everywhere, into a passion to vote? Because that's kind of the disconnect that, I don't know if you see it when you talk with young people, but that I sometimes see with the passion for activism versus the passion for voting.
Well, first, we have to stop romanticizing voting. So often when I talk to folks of my generation, of the boomer generation, about young people, they begin with this lament that young people don't understand that folks died for their right to vote. Yes, they do understand it. And you won that battle, and therefore they believe that it is their choice. But what has disconnected in our society is that there's no civic institution that actually reminds them or teaches them what the vote means. And we romanticize this notion that if you protest, change will happen because you've been able to voice your opinion. But we have yet to have the legitimate conversation that voting is not an instant solution. It is a process. It is like treating a disease, and you don't get a magic pill. You have to go through treatment after treatment after treatment. And the disease of misplaced power is one that is incredibly aggressive and will metastasize. And the minute we stop voting, the minute we stop protesting, that's when it rears back up. That's when it takes over. And that's when the antidote sometimes is worse than the disease, or so it feels. And so what we have to do is begin by being honest about what voting gets you and what it doesn't get you. I've been at this for 20 years, and I'm still fighting. But the reality is I still fight because I have seen progress. I've seen the things that I want to have change. I've seen that incremental progress. And that's the second piece. We have to celebrate the successes, and we have to demonstrate how those successes were made and what it takes to keep them. And so often we celebrate and move on instead of celebrating and sustaining. That's our challenge. And that's what I think so many young people saw in 2008. They saw this celebratory moment of the election of Barack Obama, but it was followed by this insouciance that assumed that the work was done. And therefore, all of the things they were taught to expect as young people to come out of that election never materialized, because in 2010, those who should have voted did not or could not. And the result was a decade of doom for many of the progressive causes. And so we have to, one, be honest, two, be sustained, and three, we have to connect the dots over and over again, between what we want and how we get it.
Yeah, you said 2020, you'd hurt my spirit, because I mean, this was the first election that I called the Armageddon election, because any election that's paired with a census year is doom. And I think for so many people, I think people took it so casually that, we got Obama. There were people there was a lady that I knew in Florida who changed her ringtone to just say Obama. That's all it said, like when it would ring. And so people were so excited that we got Obama, we got the black president, that people thought, well, he's in, we don't really need to do anything else. And the amount of drop off between the turnout in 2008 and 2010 was tragic. And then we got stuck with a decade of this nightmare. I have to talk about how I met you. I met you 4 years later after that. I met you in 2014. I don't know if you will remember this. I remember I met you because you were a guest. I think you were the guest just ahead of me on the Melissa Harris Perry show. And I remember listening to you and then being on with you other times on that show and thinking, wow, this sister really knows what she's talking about, because you were planning. And at the time you weren't being like super open about the numbers because you knew what you were facing in the state of Georgia, to register something like 700,000 Georgians and registering voters who were non-traditional voters in Georgia. This idea of getting people off the bench and into the game. How successful was that original effort? And talk a little bit about the legal fight that you had to go through in order to make those registrations stay on the books.
So going back to your point about 2020 and 2010, I became Democratic leader in Georgia in the wake of one of those near Armageddon elections. As bad as it was not what we faced in 2020. But I watched the complete decimation of power, not only for Democrats, but that meant largely for communities of color, because race is the strongest predictor of political leanings in the state of Georgia. And so I stepped into that job recognizing that if we wanted to have representation in a state that was fast on a demographic transition, we had to start now. And that meant including people who had exempted themselves either by intention or simply because they didn't know better from the process of voting. So there were 800,000 unregistered people of color in Georgia at the time, 600,000 of whom were African American. We launched a project that over the next decade, between 2014 and 2024, intended to register all 800,000. Our initial goal was 120,000. We were going to take on the bulk of it, but we also invested in other groups that were going to be able to speak more specifically to communities of color, like Latino community or the API community, if there were language barriers or other issues. Our effort in 2014 registered 86,000 plus people, but 40,000 of them were held hostage by then Secretary of State Brian Kemp, who first swore they didn't exist, then swore that he didn't have to process them. And finally, we discovered after a protracted investigation that he had captured at least 20,000 of them through the exact match program that the Obama administration had told his predecessor was racially discriminatory and would lead to the basically to the impediment of Black and brown voters from getting on the rolls. And that's exactly what happened. He accused me of fraud. I accused him of malfeasance and incompetence. I didn't commit fraud.
And it feels like Brian Kemp knew at the time his goal was to be governor. It's almost as if he engineered his own governorship years in advance. That's at least what it looks like from outside Georgia.
Oh, absolutely. This is a man who in 2010, when he took office, he was appointed to that office when Karen Handel left to run for another position. In that year, there was an election in Quitman, Georgia, South Georgia, and I talk about this in the book, where a group of Black women decided that they should have representation on a majority white school board that served a majority black school system. So they simply said we should have some representation. There should be more voices that have seen some of these issues up close. He had them arrested. He have 12 of them arrested, charged with 120 felonies, raided their homes near Christmas time, humiliated them. Most of them were fired from their jobs. They lost their seats, and not a single person was convicted. He began that demonstration of his disregard and deliberate indifference for voting rights in 2010, and he just accelerated it. He occasionally would do these feints that signaled that he actually cared by expanding online voter registration, which sounds great until you realize that between 25 and 40% of Georgians don't have access to the internet. And so even his goodwill tends to have some hidden poison pill. But yes, in the run up to his run for governor, on a single day before he put his name in the hat, he conducted the single largest voter purge in American history.
I mean, this is the challenge in the United States at the moment, because you do have people with political power being able to choose their voters instead of the voters choosing them. You write in a chapter in the book called "We Can See You and So Should They" about this idea about identity politics, and it's a thing that the right often brings up as well as a bad thing. But you write, single-strand identities do not exist in a household, let alone in a nation. When America is at its best, we acknowledge the complexity of our societies and the complicating reality of how we experience this country and its obstacles. You never lose sight of the fact that we all want the same thing. We all want education. We want economic security. We want health care. Identity politics pushes leaders to understand that because of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and national origin, people confront obstacles that stem from those identities. When I read that, I think about the question of, do we really want all those? What I don't understand, Stacey, I don't know if you do, there are people who seem to be arguing quite strenuously that they don't want to publicly fund education, that they don't want health care. There's an argument going on in Congress right now in which Republicans are saying, nope, we don't want to give $600 extra in unemployment because that's just paying people to stay home. And there are voters who, they exceed that. They're like, okay, that is fine, even though they're going to be the ones losing the money. What do you make of this identity that's been formed around political positioning rather than even your own needs?
There's a narrative and a through line in the South that is, and you understand this having lived in Florida, that if I can't have it, neither should anyone else, and certainly not someone who is undeserving. There's this puritanical sense of finite resources coupled with just a miserliness that has invaded how we think about the social contract we sign with one another. And so what we hear is, well, if you're not willing to, if you are out of work, that must be partially your fault. And if you need help, that's because you didn't work hard enough. And part of that comes from this long-held mythology of self-made people. In my earlier book, Lead from the Outside, I tackle this because it's one of the ways we convince communities of color and other marginalized or disadvantaged communities that you deserve what you get, especially if you don't got nothing. And so it works. I mean, it's been a through line, a narrative through line in American society since our inception. I mean, just remember, the only people who could vote when America was created, it wasn't just white men, it was white men who owned land. They were the only ones worthy of the franchise. And so we've created this narrative that says that if anyone else has, if they didn't do the things we think they should have done to get, then they don't deserve the help. And that's just wrong. There is not a single self-made person, especially in the United States. We all benefit from our collective investment in roads, in bridges, in education. I used to tell folks when I was in the legislature, I believe in public education as a fundamental right, but I also think I'd rather have those kids in school learning than robbing my house. And so it is to my benefit, even if I don't have children myself, to ensure that public education exists. And what we hear is a narrative that has largely come from the Republican Party, but unfortunately has sometimes been suborned by Democrats, is that there are the haves and the have-nots. The haves deserve what they have, and the have-nots deserve what they got. That undermines the fundamental notion of the social contract that for so long was actually what drove us. I am not a socialist. I am not a communist. I am an avowed capitalist who started a financial technology company because I think money plays a pretty good role in having been poor. I don't like it, don't plan to go there again. But that said, I do not begrudge my opportunity to support others because it was those supports that helped me be where I am today.
Absolutely. Well said. You can get an amen on that. You write about getting our credibility back. My closing question to you will be this. If you could design a bill, let's say the Democrats somehow manage to win the White House and the Senate and hold the House, and then they have the opportunity to write a bill in the same way that Democrats finally got the opportunity in July of 2009 to write a stimulus bill and eventually to write a health care bill. If you could design the perfect bill that would restore the full right to vote and make democracy stronger in America, what would you put in it?
So I would begin with automatic registration, because the moment we put an obstacle into the very beginning of participation, we have thwarted full enfranchisement. Automatic registration, same-day registration, because when you move from place to place, there is legitimacy in constraining how you can participate, but you just need to prove that you're in the right place and they should let you vote. Number two, I would mandate that there be mail-in voting, early voting, and election day voting at voting centers so that you could vote from anywhere within your state. This notion that you have to be in one precinct in order to cast a ballot is an anachronism and is no longer necessary. Three, I would make DC a state and tell Puerto Rico, come on board, if you will,
yes,
so that we can make certain that we right size our democracy to recognize the populations that we have. And I would restore the Voting Rights Act. However, I would expand the Voting Rights Act to cover every single state. And I would set a protocol that says that if you are not participatory in sustaining our democracy as a state that does the administration, then you are subject to oversight. We have to set a floor for what democracy can be, not a ceiling for who can be admitted. And if we do those things, if we wrap ourselves around actually creating a functional and accessible democracy that recognizes that if you're disabled, if you have a language barrier, if you're homeless, if you're displaced, if you just don't like the way things happen, but you want to make a change, we should make it as easy to vote as we make it easy to vote for, politicians as we make it to vote for anything else. And these are sustainable things. And if we do it and make it a national federal law that precludes states from ever dropping below these standards, then that is how you create democracy for the first time that is for all Americans. And by the way, I would also remove all the carceral restrictions that we have in the nation. If Vermont and Maine can allow people to vote while in jail, there should be no prohibition against people being able to vote. If you paid your debt to society or you're in the process, you deserve to participate in the society that you're a part of.
I'm loving this. I'm going to need to fast forward myself to 2024, and you're just going to have to run for president. We just got to make you have all the jobs. You can be on the Supreme Court and be president at the same time. I don't think there's a rule against it. That's my goal. Then you need to do that. Stacey Abrams, you're so brilliant. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. The book is called Our Time Is Now. Sister, thank you for just being. Thank you for existing. The work that you're doing is very important. So thank you for taking the time.
Joy, it is always a pleasure to be with you, one of the smartest and most thoughtful minds in journalism. Thank you.
You're so sweet. Thank you very much. All right, Stacey. Thank you. Thank you, Stacey Abrams. Here's the book, Our Time Is Now. It's actually her second book. The first book, of course, the biographical book that was a New York Times bestseller. This is a great book. Everyone should read it. On the back of the book, Nancy Pelosi gives a word. Kerry Washington, Hassan Minhaj, Issa Rae, Madeleine Albright, Julian Castro. So obviously this book got a lot of acclaim. And it's got a lot of good advice for democracy. I have high hopes for Stacey Abrams' future. If she doesn't wind up on the Biden ticket, I can see so many jobs for her. I think she could be any of those jobs. President,
She'll be a great
Supreme
governor
Court.
of Georgia.
And you know what?
Supreme
don't
Court
sleep.
be fantastic also.
But don't sleep. She might come right back at you, Brian Kemp. She might be back. All right. So thank you to Stacey Abrams. I really appreciate y'all tuning in for this episode of What to Read. If you like it and love it, please comment on it. If you are on the YouTubes, please hit the little, what is it called? The notification, the little notification thing.
Okay.
The bell.
There you go.
I always have to remember the bell so you can be notified of the next episode. Please subscribe, whether on YouTube or on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, because we want you guys to never miss an episode. Because you know what? We do because we love.
Yeah, we do it all the time because we love.
We do because we love. All right. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next
What to Read.
What to Read.
Bye, fam.
Bye.